Hello, I'm Rebecca Piper. I'm here today talking to Martin Douglas, one of our PhD researchers. Martin, I saw a conference paper of yours come out recently that seems to have gone down really well. Can you explain to us what stage of your research you're at with that and a little bit more about it?
Okay, I'm sort of being supervised by Joe Peppard in the information systems area together with Stan Macklin from the marketing team. This particular paper is drawing on the PhD research, but looking at using a situated learning or a communities of practice lens on big data projects and seeing what that reveals about these projects that we may not understand using a more traditional project management lens.
Can you just talk a little bit more about what situated learning means?
Learning is a vast subject area which I've been trying to get to grips with, but essentially you get different traditions within learning, and some of it's focused very much at individual learning, and that tends to break down very much into, say, cognitively led learning, which is about how do we perceive things cognitively and how can we optimize that, as opposed to what a slightly more social tradition, which is more about the fact that learning can be an everyday thing that we do as we live our lives effectively, or that it's through experience that we learn. So you've got another tradition there around much more experientially based learning. Typically that's situated within a particular social setting, and hence it's sometimes called situated learning. Now, where the communities of practice sort of tradition comes from is saying, well, often that situation is within a practice community, you know, endeavouring to do stuff that a practitioner would do in a job setting or a work setting. So professions would be a classic example of a community of practice, be it accountants or something like that. And you know, this would be the on-the-job type learning that you might do, as opposed to the textbook type learning that one might do.
Okay, so is this something that happens ordinarily anyway? Is this something that everybody does in their place of work?
Well, what we were interested in is looking at big data projects or data projects more generally, and a lot of the thinking around those is that it's about trying to apply algorithms and analysis to particular data, and that would give us answers that would be particularly useful and insights. Now, what that often doesn't look at then is, well, what problems are we trying to solve? You know, for whom are we trying to solve those problems? How are those going to be used? You know, who's actually generating this insight? You lose sight of the human agency involved in the middle of all of that. So what we wanted to do is say, well, actually, rather than take a traditional, say, project management lens to that, or algorithmic lens, what would be revealed if we actually looked at it through more of a social learning lens? You know, what would that reveal about these kind of projects that might be interesting and we may not be paying enough attention to at the moment? Very much with a view to, you know, how can we generate better insight or more useful insight, make sure we get benefits from these data projects. So that was the kind of motivation, and you know, why we were going down this social learning lens idea, if you like, of looking at these projects that way.
That's really interesting. Can you expand on the sort of who you were doing this research with and your methodology?
From a research design perspective, we were kind of very traditionally looking at most of these data initiatives would be in a project setting or an initiative setting. So even if it's not a formal project, it's kind of got that feel about it. So we were very clear we didn't want to look at just individuals. We wanted to look at this kind of group of individuals, often drawn from different parts of organizations, working on a joint effort to try and do something with data to inform a strategy or whatever. So we looked very much at two very contrasting organizations to see, well, you know, if we looked at two very different data projects in different settings, what would that reveal about what was similar and different in different settings? So the one example that we looked at was what we've termed Posh Council, which is a district council in the UK, and they were trying to, under pressure of government funding being cut and constraints, try and come up with new revenue generating propositions for some of the people in their particular district. So they wanted that to be informed by good sort of household data and basically customer data, and they were interested in looking at acorn data as a way of better understanding the target market that they might be trying to address, as well as testing some of these ideas and propositions about, well, you know, how would they fit preferences or whatever it might be for those particular households in terms of their priorities. So that was one context, very much in the public sector, quite a small marketing team, and they were trying to influence the rest of their sort of organisation. The second case, much bigger in scale, especially in terms of the amount of data being collected and so on, was what we've termed InfraDig, which was a large infrastructure project where they were basically trying to create what they termed a virtual version of the infrastructure that they were trying to build. So they were trying to build a huge, big rail infrastructure. What they wanted to do was make a difference to maintenance of that subsequently. And they felt that actually having much better data about the infrastructure that they were building available to maintenance operators later on would mean that maintenance could be done in a much smarter way, because they'd be able to actually interrogate this data and see different insights about how best to maintain this, or when interventions might be better required, or organising particular interventions to cover as many bases in the most effective way as possible. So that was the kind of premise really in that particular case. A lot more complex organisationally, because it wasn't within one organisation. You had the infrastructure project organisation that was building the infrastructure and pulling together the data about it. But actually the operating community were actually going to be sitting in the operating company, often subcontracted to other operating companies in terms of the ones who do the maintenance. So organisationally quite complex in terms of lots of handoffs, the people collecting the data being very different to the people who might be using the data and so on. So again, lots of those kind of complexities coming through in that case.
You've already illustrated some of your findings, I think, throughout what you've been talking about, but can you perhaps highlight 2 or 3 of your key findings and also talk about the value of the research that you're doing and who it would be applicable to?
Okay, so what we were really interested in initially was this very simplistic view of a data project, which is you have some data, you add some analysis and you get an answer. And we wanted something which was a better framework really for people to kind of think about these projects and realise, well, which constituent elements are important to manage. So what's come out of the analysis that we've been doing over the last year or so is really that there is a much richer form of thinking about these, and we've come up with a bit of framework of which kind of constituent parts are particularly important. Now, that will be in a slide deck that we'll link to this as well. So it's quite a rich model, but essentially what we've come out at it is, we initially thought there'd be quite a lot of a really inquiry-led approach might be interesting, or a learning-led approach might be an interesting way of thinking about these projects, as opposed to a process of just having one thing, adding something else and getting an answer. That did prove true, and the interesting thing there is there was a bit of an analogy with the kind of work that we were doing through our research. So if you think of a data project almost as a research project where we're trying to find out about a phenomenon that you're interested in, be it customers in the case of the one posh council, or be it better maintenance practice being the phenomenon for the InfraDig case. Then what would data be able to shed light on in relation to those? So there's this relationship between a phenomenon that you're interested in and the data that you might collect about that, and what that may or may not tell you about that phenomenon, very much with a view to then being able to influence your practice or inform your practice or shed new light on that particular phenomenon and so on. So those were some of the key elements. What that then also highlighted was that where different communities or practitioners are involved in, say, data collection versus the actual use or the management and so on, they all come to these projects with their own idea of what they're doing and their characterizations of the project. So if you spoke to people who were doing the data collection, they would think of it very much in terms of data collection. We're trying to create this data artifact. And you lose sight of the ultimate use, potentially. Or they might be looking at it very much through systems or tools that they're using, and the kind of data that they'll collect are based on the fields that are actually available in the tools that they're using. And that will limit potentially what they can find out about a phenomenon, because that in a sense is a snapshot of what a particular developer thought was relevant about that particular phenomenon at the point in time that they developed the tool. So you get these interesting sort of bounding effects of, if you're using particular tools, then you're looking at a particular phenomenon through a particular lens of what data they think might be relevant, and you're also trying to interact with that data through a particular interface, which may make certain things easier or certain kinds of analysis more easy than others. So these choices that are often made very early on in projects, before they really understand what the project phenomenon is, before they really understand what data might be relevant, tends to lock in quite a few of these parts. And unless you're really kind of clear about how clear you are about the phenomenon, how relatively clear you are about what data you're collecting and so on, these things can move around and shift quite a lot in an exploratory project. So we kind of, one of the practical things that is coming out there is that you don't want to make these choices. You want to keep them quite loose and less fixed until you've got a bit more clarity about some of these constituent parts. So you may well be iterating quite a lot to get to that clarity, and you may use maybe more generic tools to help you get a clearer idea of which of these data elements about this seem to be the most useful ones. Are there missing data elements? Are we measuring them in the right way? Are they detailed, too detailed, not detailed enough? What sort of scope do we really need to concentrate on? Which dimensions about these phenomena are actually worth looking at? As well as then, I think one of the second themes that's coming out is that the learning that does occur can occur about lots of different things. It can occur about the phenomenon, it can occur about the tools, it can occur about how to manage this data effectively. But ultimately, if it's about trying to improve practice and practitioner knowledge, you need those practitioners to be engaging with the data in order to learn something about it. And there's some very interesting dynamics there around, well, if they can interact with the phenomenon themselves, be it maintenance, they have their own experience to draw on and all the rest of it, why look at the data? So there's got to be a compelling reason why the data might shed some light on this phenomenon that they wouldn't get from their own existing experience. So you get all these hurdles about, well, if the tool's difficult to use, if they don't think that this data is going to tell them anything that they don't already know, these all become factors in, well, are they going to use it at all or not? And if they're not involved in the design of the data, they're not involved in the project per se, they may well see this data artifact as something that somebody else has created and ask them to use, rather than their own sort of research-led kind of data that they've collected as they've tried to find out about a project or about a phenomenon. So there are these interesting social effects around ownership of these data elements, tools mediating or getting in the way. So there are a lot of these sort of things that you need to manage in a program, particularly where it's a new phenomenon, or the data is new, or the tool's new. And there are all these kind of learning hurdles involved in each of those different components.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Martin. It's probably a subject that a lot of big organisations are grappling with at the moment, so very relevant.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Pleasure.